The morning of February 28, 2026, began like most mornings in Tehran. Street vendors opened their carts. Children walked to school. A woman named Mariam stepped out onto her apartment balcony with a cup of tea, looking at the pale sky above the Alborz Mountains. She had survived the January protests. She had survived the weeks-long internet blackout.
She was raising the cup to her lips when the first explosion shook her window so hard it cracked clean across.
She stood there gripping the railing, watching a column of black smoke rise to the south. Then a second explosion, then a third. The low, continuous thunder that never stopped told her this was not a single strike. This was the thing people had been whispering about for months, finally arriving at the door, 3,000 miles away.
In the Situation Room, beneath the West Wing of the White House,
President Donald Trump watched a live satellite feed of Tehran. The targets had been locked for weeks. The decision was no longer theoretical. America was at war with Iran. To understand how February 28 happened, you have to go back to 1979, when Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. That humiliation never fully healed. It calcified into a foundational assumption on both sides that the United States and the Islamic Republic were, at their cores, incompatible. That the reckoning was always only a matter of when. For decades, both sides avoided direct war through proxies and plausible deniability. Iran built Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi militias, and the Houthis, responded with sanctions, cyber operations, and assassinations. The nuclear program was always the most dangerous piece on the board. In 2015, the Obama administration struck the JCPOA deal, freezing Iran's enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. It worked until Trump withdrew from it in 2018. Iran then began stockpiling enriched uranium rapidly.
By December 2024, the IAEA reported Iran had enough highly enriched uranium to theoretically fuel multiple warheads.
October 7, 2023 changed everything. Hamas killed over 1,200 Israelis in a single day. Iran had funded and supported Hamas for years. Israel's response reshaped the Middle East, systematically destroying Iran's axis of resistance. Hezbollah was decapitated. Assad fell in Syria. Iran struck Israel directly twice, with massive missile barrages. Israel intercepted most of them. Iran was defiant, but running out of partners. In April 2025, Trump sent Khamenei a letter offering one final chance at diplomacy. Talks began in Oman between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Arakshi. Multiple rounds followed. The outlines of a deal were briefly visible. Then Israel struck Iran on June 13, 2025, hitting nuclear facilities and killing military commanders in a surprise attack. The 12-day war erupted. Iran fired over 500 ballistic missiles at Israel.
The U.S. joined the campaign, striking 3 Iranian nuclear sites. A ceasefire followed 12 days later. The nuclear question remained unresolved. The months after were a slow unraveling. Iran's currency collapsed. New sanctions piled on. On December 28, 2025, protests erupted across all 31 provinces, the largest uprising since 1979. Workers, teachers, shopkeepers filled the streets, demanding not reform, but the end of the system itself. Khamenei ordered a brutal crackdown. Security forces used live ammunition and drones against protesters. The bloodiest days were January 8 and 10, 2026. Iran imposed the longest internet blackout in any country's history. The death toll ranged from 3,000 to 32,000, depending on who was counting. Trump threatened military action. The killing continued anyway. Began its largest military buildup in the Middle East since 2003. A final round of talks collapsed in Geneva on February 26th. 2 days later, the bombs fell. U.S. and Israeli forces struck Iran's nuclear facilities, military bases, and leadership. Among the first killed was Khamenei himself, assassinated in the opening hours of the attack. Iran responded with missiles targeting Israel, U.S. bases across the region, and oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf. Within 72 hours, the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Oil prices surged 30% in a single day. The world economy shuddered. For 40 days, the war burned. On April 8, 2026, a ceasefire was announced. Trump declared total and complete victory. Iran's new leadership instructed military units to stand down. This is not the end of the war, state television broadcast, but all military branches should follow the Supreme Leader's order and cease their fire. Pakistan brokered talks in Islamabad. Two exhausted delegations sat across a table, trying to find language that could be called peace.
But inside the Iranian delegation's hotel,
A mid-level IRGC officer sat alone with a satellite phone.
He had survived February 28 by chance, sheltering in a basement in Isfahan when the building above him was destroyed. He had a number memorized that he had never dialed, given to him years earlier with one instruction: use it only when everything else is gone. He dialed. The phone rang twice. Someone picked up. The voice spoke English, American English, calm,
with a slight southern accent.
"We've been waiting," the voice said. "Are you ready to talk about what really happened on February 28th?
The IRGC officer's name was Dariush Kashani. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with a scar along his left jaw from a training accident in 2009. He had joined the Revolutionary Guard not out of ideology, but out of necessity. It was the best job available to a young man from a poor family in Isfahan with no connections and no university degree. Over 20 years, he had risen steadily, not because he was brilliant or ruthless,
But because he was reliable.
he showed up, he kept his mouth shut, he followed orders. Until February 28th. On that morning, Dariush had been in the basement of a logistics building in Isfahan, reviewing supply manifests, when the ceiling above him disappeared. Not collapsed, disappeared. One moment it was there. The next, there was open sky and a column of fire where the upper 3 floors had been.
He crawled out through rubble, bleeding from his forehead, his ears ringing so badly he could not hear his own voice when he tried to call for help. Around him, the military district of Isfahan was burning. He walked for 2 hours through smoke and chaos before finding a vehicle. He drove west. He did not stop driving until he reached a farmhouse owned by a cousin who asked no questions. He stayed there for 3 weeks. During that time, he listened.
He had a small shortwave radio and a phone that still worked on a rural network. The blackout had not fully severed. He heard the ceasefire announced. He heard Trump declare victory. He heard Pakistan offer to host negotiations. And he heard, through a channel so obscure and encrypted, it would take any intelligence agency months to find it. A voice he recognized. A voice he had last heard 4 years earlier in a meeting he was not supposed to have attended. In a room he was not supposed to have entered.
The voice belonged to a man named Colonel Farzan Moradi.
Except Farzan Moradi had been listed as killed on February 28th in the initial Iranian government casualty reports.
His name was on the official list of martyrs. His photograph had been broadcast on state television alongside 12 other senior IRGC officers.
Farzan Moradi was not dead, and what Dariush heard him say in that brief encrypted transmission was 7 words that made his blood go cold.
The enriched uranium was moved before the strikes.
In Islamabad, the negotiations were not going well. The American delegation, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, arrived with a list of demands that the Iranian side immediately called maximalist and humiliating. Complete and permanent cessation of all uranium enrichment. Full dismantlement of centrifuge infrastructure under international supervision.
Handover of all remaining enriched uranium stockpiles to a neutral third party. Termination of support for all regional proxy groups. Normalization of relations with Israel as a long-term condition. The Iranian delegation, led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Arakchi, responded with their own list. Immediate and permanent lifting of all U.S. sanctions. Formal U.S. apology for the February 28th strikes.
Compensation for civilian casualties. recognition of Iran's right to peaceful nuclear technology.
Withdrawal of all U.S. military assets from the Persian Gulf within 5 years. The two lists had almost nothing in common. Pakistani mediators shuttled between rooms. Phone calls were made to Beijing, to Moscow, to Riyadh. The ceasefire was technically holding, but Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq had already attacked U.S. facilities twice since it took effect. The Houthis were making noises about resuming Red Sea operations. The situation was a ceasefire in name only.
A pause between rounds, rather than anything resembling peace.
On the third day of talks, Rubio received an intelligence report that made him go quiet for a long time. Satellite imagery, cross-referenced with signals intelligence, and a single human source whose identity the CIA was protecting aggressively, suggested that a significant quantity of highly enriched uranium, possibly enough for 3 to 5 weapons, had been transported out of Iran's primary enrichment facility at Fordow, approximately 72 hours before the February 28th strikes began. The convoy had moved at night, under commercial vehicle cover, heading northwest. It had crossed into a neighboring country, and then the trail went cold. The report had a one-word classification stamp at the top that indicated its sensitivity level. Below that, in a box reserved for the analyst's assessment of confidence, someone had written, "Hi." Rubio read the report twice. Then he folded it, placed it in his jacket pocket, and walked back into the negotiating room with an expression that his staff later described as controlled. Professionally controlled. The kind of controlled that takes years of practice to maintain when everything you thought you understood about a situation has just shifted underneath you. Dariush arrived in Islamabad on a Pakistani commercial flight using a passport that did not belong to him. He had been traveling for 4 days, moving through 3 countries, guided by instructions delivered in fragments through the encrypted channel. He did not know who was on the other end of the channel. He did not know who had given him the passport. He did not know what the American voice on the satellite phone had meant when it said, "We've been waiting." What he knew was this. He had seen something on February 27th, the day before the strikes, that he had told no one about. He had been at Fordow. Not officially.
He had been there to deliver a set of technical documents to an engineer he had worked with years before. The delivery was routine. But while he was waiting in a corridor, he had watched through a window as a convoy of vehicles was loaded in the facility's underground bay. Heavy crates, sealed containers marked with a designation he recognized from classified briefings. The loading had taken 3 hours. The convoy moved out through a tunnel exit he had not known existed. He had filed no report. He had told no one. Partly because he was not supposed to be there. Partly because, in the Islamic Republic, seeing things you were not supposed to see and reporting them was more dangerous than staying silent. And partly because somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that what he had witnessed was something so significant that the wrong word to the wrong person could get him killed before he even reached his car.
Now, sitting in a small hotel room in Islamabad, he finally told someone.
The man listening to him was American, young, perhaps 35, with the kind of unremarkable face that is professionally cultivated to be forgotten. He had introduced himself only as David. He took no notes. He asked precise, quiet questions. He did not react visibly to anything Dariush said. When Dariush finished, David sat in silence for almost a full minute. Then he said, "The convoy went northwest. Do you know where it was going?" Dariush nodded slowly. "It was going to a facility that officially doesn't exist," he said. "In a country that is officially not involved in any of this." David leaned forward slightly. "Which country?" Dariush told him. The answer was not Russia. It was not China. It was not any of the countries that American intelligence had been watching most closely for exactly this scenario. It was a country whose involvement would not merely complicate the Islamabad negotiations. It would detonate them. It would reshape the entire geopolitical framework within which the war had been understood, fought, and now theoretically ended. David stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Dariush with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite alarm, but somewhere between the two. "Stay in this room," he said. "Do not contact anyone. Do not open the door for anyone except me."
Dariush sat alone in the room and listened to the sounds of Islamabad through the window. Traffic, a distant call to prayer, the ordinary noise of a city that did not yet know it was sitting at the center of something that was about to change everything. His satellite phone, sitting on the table in front of him, buzzed once. A message. No sender ID, 4 words. They already know. Run.